What's up, everybody? Do you hate racism? Do you hate slavery? Good. You should, because they're both wicked in the sight of God. And thankfully, it was the Christians who worked hard to abolish slavery here in America, and before that, in Britain as well. If you're new to my channel, my name is Matt, one of the pastors here at Gospel Fellowship PCA, Presbyterian Church, just north of Pittsburgh. We are Reformed in our theology, conservative, Bible believing in our views. Come check us out if you're anywhere north of Pittsburgh. Well, you know, Christians get a lot of bad press today, and certainly in the universities and the academies, Christians are looked on as though we are part of the problem, the patriarchy, the conservative right, all that kind of thing. But what a lot of people fail to acknowledge, and I think is a real historical problem, is that it was the Christians who worked hard to abolish slavery here in the West, and that is an undisputed fact. It was the Christians. If you hate slavery, then I would say hug a Christian today, because it was those Bible-believing evangelicals that worked so hard for the destruction of that institution. Now, almost every culture and society around the world and throughout history has had slavery in some form or another, whether you want to talk about Africa or China or the ancient Romans, wherever you want to go, slavery has existed. But it was the worldview of the Christians that was necessary in order to end slavery. You see, Christians have a very unique belief and doctrine in their views, and that is that we Christians believe in the doctrine of the imago Dei, the image of God, that every single human being has the image of God. And so whether one is black or white or Asian or European or African or Caribbean, whatever you are, you have the very image of God impressed upon your life. Genesis 1:26 and 27. It was the Christian view of the worth of mankind that ultimately led to the downfall of the institution of slavery, abolition, here in the West. And I just want to tick through some facts with you, if you don't mind. Let's go first to William Wilberforce, 1759 to 1833. William Wilberforce was probably the dominant force for the abolition of slavery in the United Kingdom, or England, or Britain, as it is called. He worked very hard within Parliament, brought proposals time and time again to the British Parliament before finally being successful. By the way, this is interesting too, that you may not know this, but William Wilberforce was an early advocate in a movement called the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. That too. So not only did he work hard to abolish slavery, which eventually happened in the United Kingdom, but also defended the lives of your friendly little critters as well. How about Jonathan Edwards Jr., 1745 to 1801, Calvinistic minister and early preacher of abolition. In fact, he wrote a series of articles called Some Observations on the Slavery of Negroes in the Connecticut Journal and the New Haven Post. And he also worked in a sermon called The Injustice and the Impolicy of the Slave Trade. And he, along with Samuel Hopkins, very much contributed to the theological undergirding of abolition here in America. Speaking of Samuel Hopkins, another Calvinistic, conservative, congregational minister, he published a pamphlet entitled A Dialogue Concerning Slavery of the Africans, which was addressed to, guess what, the Continental Congress, representatives of the 13 United American colonies. He called the slaves brethren and children. Why? Because that's how Christians view one another, as brothers in Christ and children of the great and living God. So he was a successful abolitionist as well. How about Sojourner Truth? I'm sure you've heard of her, 1797 to 1833. She was a member of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, African Methodist Episcopal, which is essentially an offshoot of Methodist theology, but a denomination founded by, for, and comprised of African Americans, many of them former slaves. Sojourner Truth gave herself that name, Sojourner Truth, as a testimony to her conversion. Her famous speech it actually took place in Ohio, in Akron, her Ain't I a Woman speech. Now, interesting that that's given a stereotypical Southern dialect, because Sojourner Truth actually grew up in New York speaking Dutch as her first language, so she probably didn't exactly speak like that, but nevertheless, that's how we remember the speech today. She is remembered by the Smithsonian Magazine as one of the 100 most significant Americans of all time. and she was a Christian. Don't lose sight on that. How about Harriet Beecher Stowe, 1811 to 1896, a Presbyterian, how dear to my heart, an American abolitionist author. She is the author of the very famous book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, 1852, which basically exposed the slavery practice for many, many readers to see and understand exactly what it was like. She wrote 30 books, and her father, a Presbyterian minister, another abolition preaching, Bible believing Calvinist. Gotta love that. In fact, she came from a whole family of brothers who also became abolitionist preaching, Bible believing evangelical Christians. So thank God for her. Harriet Tubman, 1822 to 1913, another member of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. She is famous for her work in the Underground Railroad. 13 missions she led. Approximately 70 enslaved people, led them to slavery. Why did she do that? Because she loved Jesus and believed in the doctrine of the Imago Dei. She was called the Great Moses, and is famed for never having lost a passenger as she led people to freedom in the Underground Railroad. How about Elijah Lovejoy? Elijah Parrish Lovejoy, 1802 to 1937. Another Presbyterian. Gosh, we're on a roll here, aren't we? Presbyterian minister, journalist, abolitionist, preacher. He was shot and killed by a pro-slavery mob in Illinois. And according to John Quincy Adams, it was this event that shook like an earthquake throughout the country, prompting John Brown to publicly say, here before God in the presence of these witnesses, from this time I consecrate my life to the destruction of slavery. How about this one? Frederick Douglass. You've heard of him, certainly, haven't you? One of the greats, 1818 to 1895, another member of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. He was a licensed preacher. That's right, a pastor. My goodness, how good is this? Licensed to preach, 1739. He was an American social reformer, abolitionist, preaching messenger of God. He wrote 3 autobiographies of himself. He was a freed slave. He was the anti-testimony to those who believed that slaves were not intelligent or rational as others. He clearly proved himself to be one of the greatest minds of his time, and he was in fact a Bible-believing, preaching pastor. Gotta like that. How about the Quakers, the Friends, the Society of Friends? Evangelicals, did you know that? A little bit unusual amongst the Protestants, but they are evangelical, Bible-believing Christians, famous for being one of the most organized and passionate movements of abolition in the late 1700s, early 1800s. The Underground Railroad itself, if you look up the destinations of the stations where they hid people as they brought them north, 22 of these stations were, guess what? Churches, Bible-believing Christian churches. And finally this, although he comes after the abolition of slavery, Martin Luther King Jr., 1929 to 1968, American civil rights leader, of course, famous for the Selma gatherings, famous for the Montgomery bus boycott. But don't forget, he was also a Bible-believing, preaching Baptist Christian. And yes, I realize, before you even say it in the comments, I realize all these people have flaws in their lives and their character, but that's not the point. The point is that it was their Bibles, it was their Christian faith, it was their convictions of the great and living God and the equality of human beings, the doctrine of the Imago Dei, that led them to the conviction that racism is heinous, slavery is wrong, and they worked towards the abolition of it. And so if you hate racism and if you hate slavery, then by all means hug an evangelical Bible-believing Christian today, because it was they who worked towards the destruction of slavery as an institution. Well, thank you so much for checking into this YouTube video. Hope you learned something today. Hope you realize how thankful we are for the Christians that came before us. Thanks for checking in. Love you lots, and we'll talk to you later.